Thank you all for joining us today. We are so delighted by the turnout, but not surprised that so many people are interested in the topic of historic murals. This is work that we've been doing for a long time. For those of you who don't know us well, NCAC promotes free expression and opposes censorship. We work primarily in two areas: protecting the free expression rights of young people and artists. With me today is my colleague Svetlana Mincheva, who directs both our Youth Free Expression program and our Arts Advocacy program. And she will be talking about our other work involving public art in the Q&A session that follows the panel. Of course, we can't do any of this work without support from people like you. If you think this conversation is valuable, we urge you to make a donation to ncac.org/donate. We're also anxious to hear your ideas for future programs, and you can send them to us at ncac@ncac.org. We've got a really interesting discussion coming. Let there be no further delay. I'm going to hand off to our host, Anthony Huffman. Anthony, thank you for everything you've done to help pull this panel together. And will you introduce everyone?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chris, for getting us started. And thank you to everyone else at NCAC for your collective efforts in coordinating this important talk and bringing it together. Particularly, I'd like to thank Svetlana and Rebecca, as well as Rachel, who provided research and administrative assistance for this panel. To briefly introduce myself before I read the bios of our panelists today, I'm an independent scholar, curator, and cultural critic based here in Brooklyn, New York. Before my research roles at Hauser and Wirth, I was an intern in the programming department at Creative Time, and before that, I was an assistant project manager for MTA Arts and Design, which is the public art program or division of New York City Transit. Just a brief reminder, if you do have questions as they come to you during the presentation or during our panel's discussion, please input those questions into the Q&A chat, and then we will get to them at the last, roughly last 30 minutes of today's event. And yet, without further ado, I'm honored at this distinct privilege today of sharing this virtual stage with Dr. Adrienne Lim and Karen Olivier. Dr. Adrienne Lim is the Dean of Libraries at the University of Maryland, College Park. A native of Detroit, she's a first-generation college student, earning her bachelor's degree in fine arts and her master's degree in library and information science, both from Wayne State University, summa cum laude. Dr. Lim earned her doctorate in library and information sciences at Simmons University in Boston, specializing in managerial leadership. She has published numerous book chapters and articles, including a paper on readability published in the Journal of Academic Librarianship, which was named among the top 20 articles in 2010. Lim was honored with the Loletta D. Fyan Award for Creative Library Service from the Michigan Library Association and the Butler Award for Excellence in Faculty Service at Portland State. Formerly, she served as the Dean of Libraries and Philip H. Knight Chair at the University of Oregon. In 2017, Dr. Lim launched the Knight Library Public Art Task Force at the University of Oregon and was involved in attempting to resolve the controversy surrounding the WPA murals on campus. Our other panelist is Karen Olivier. Born in Trinidad and Tobago in 1968 and raised in the United States, Olivier received an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art and a BA at Dartmouth College. Currently, she is an associate professor of sculpture at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University. Olivier has been the recipient of numerous prestigious grants and prizes, including the Rome Prize, the New York Foundation for the Arts Award, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award, to only name a few. Moreover, her work has been supported by grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, Creative Capital, and the Harpo Foundation. Her installations, sculptures, and other works of art have been reviewed in many leading publications, most notably the New York Times, Art in America, Art Forum, and Nika, Journal of Contemporary African Art. She is exhibited at the Guangzhou and Busan Biennials, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, the Whitney Museum of Art, and MoMA PS1, among several other noteworthy venues. Olivier's work can be found in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the Studio Museum of Harlem. And with that, I will go ahead and allow Dr. Lim to do the first portion of our presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen to get us started. And I will pass it off to you, Adrienne.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you for your kind introduction. And thanks to the National Coalition Against Censorship for inviting me to be part of this panel and for the hard work it takes to make meetings like this happen. It's an honor to be here with you and with Karen this afternoon. My remarks will be centered on the controversy related to the University of Oregon's WPA murals and panels, which are located in the Knight Library in the heart of UO's main campus in Eugene. For me, this question about resolving tensions related to race and representation in public art will always be an ongoing struggle. These tensions are not easily or entirely resolved, especially perhaps if you're a librarian like me who cares about creating brave but also welcoming spaces, who identifies as an anti-racist woman of color and as a lesbian feminist as I do. I have come to believe that the resolution of these tensions concerning race and power in public art, for me, will always involve a consideration of both the historical and the current context of each case. Even if, as I advocate for our decisions to be guided by our values of democracy, freedom of expression, intellectual freedom, and social justice. That is surely not a path toward easy resolution of tensions. Focusing on some of the contextual details of the UO case then, in this first slide that you're looking at, you can see the facade of the Knight Library. The library was constructed by architect Ellis Lawrence and is situated in a memorial quad on the campus that contains several historic buildings designated as national landmarks. Construction on the library began in 1935, and WPA funding for the art within the building was confirmed that same year. The completed building and its artwork opened in 1937. The Knight Library itself was registered as a National Historic Place in 1990. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see two of the WPA works. These are panels with text inscriptions, both painted by Nolan B. Zane in 1937. The one on the right, entitled The Mission of a University, has inspired several protests and acts of vandalism. For context though, I think it's important to share details about the physical location of these panels. The panels are located in two low traffic stairwells that are used exclusively to reach the Knight Library's special collections and university archives areas. I would argue that a typical visitor or student could come into the Knight Library on a regular basis, use most of the library's services, spaces, and vast general collections, and not encounter these works at all. For me, the fact about their location in a historic part of the building, in stairwells that I just described, the fact that visitors would not have to linger long or engage with the panels if they didn't wish to do this, this was a factor in my own decisions to defend against censoring of the works. The mission of the university displays text written by Frederick G. Young, former dean of Oregon School of Sociology. The controversial text states in part, quote, "From now on, it must be a climb if our nation is to hold its position among the nations of the earth. It means conservation and betterment, not only of our national resources, but also of our racial heritage and of opportunity to the lowliest, end quote. The inscription panel on the left is entitled Opportunity for the Youth of Oregon. It features text from Louilla Clay Carson, a former professor and administrator at the university. Somewhat instructive for the current topic of our session today, interestingly, part of her text reads, quote, "It is a responsibility to tear down errors of the past and to put in their place new ideals. It is a greater responsibility to hold fast to the truth of the past, undisturbed in the complex, experimental present," end quote. Next slide, please. Although the mission panel in the previous slide sparked the strongest protests with its overt appeal to protect racial heritage, in this slide you can see images of two 1937 wall murals measuring 4 feet by 12 feet. They're located in the same stairwells as the inscription panels, but they're very large and they attract more general attention than the panels. The mural on the left is entitled Development of the Arts, and the one on the right is Development of the Sciences. The panels were created by Arthur and Albert Runquist, two artist brothers who were also UO graduates. The Runquist brothers were regarded as politically progressive in their own time, but their imagery showing white male-centered civilization as ascendant and superior to brown-skinned people, especially women, who are equated with animals and nature at the bottom of the civilization hierarchy, have raised serious issues about white supremacist history in Oregon, about gender, race, and privilege. In 2017, a student posted a petition at change.org entitled, "Let's get these racist murals removed, #tear-it-down." She accompanied the petition with a photo of artwork depicting robed Klansmen, even though the photo had nothing to do with the WPA artwork in question. Over 1,700 signatures were collected at the time, but I wasn't sure at the time whether those signatures belonged to university affiliates. In the petition, the student said that she found the murals and the panels to be, quote, "extremely offensive and degrading to students of color, denigrating our very existence on the campus," end quote. But during this period, I also heard from other students of color and faculty of color who implored with me not to cover or try to remove the murals. I didn't feel, just as an aside, that I had that power to begin with, but these are the messages that they sent to me. Their messages described how the art aided their education and teaching about racism, especially in Oregon. My response in return was to work with cross-campus partners to increase our efforts to use the works for educational purposes and to contextualize them with research guides, explanatory labels, and public forums. At one such public forum entitled Public Art, Cultural Memory, and Anti-Racism, for example, Laura Pulido, professor and head of ethnic studies, said, quote, "The only way to move forward, to not be held hostage to our past, is to engage the past. I understand that many want to tear down racist symbols of the past for reasons I respect," she said, "but I am opposed to such erasures. To dismantle the racist symbols of the past is to eradicate the evidence of a violent white supremacist history. This is exactly what we don't need. Please do not take this mural down. This mural is part of the Great Reckoning. This mural is a powerful indictment of the past," end quote. Next slide, please. In 2018, an unknown person smeared red paint across the words racial heritage in the mission panel. The person also posted a small placard near the panel that posed the question, "Which art do you choose to conserve now?" A different unknown person posted a response next to this act, which bore the title, "A Library's Mission." That placard read in part, quote, We hold sacred the record of human activity, even though it may be offensive to current opinion or perspective. We protect and defend the democratic principle that we as a nation learn from our past in order to secure a better society for future generations, end quote. And then this is paraphrased from an open letter I wrote to the campus community. Those of us who espouse core library values, such as intellectual freedom, democracy, and social responsibility, believe the search for truth and knowledge requires access to the perspectives of not only those in the dominant culture, but also the voices of people with less power in our society, people whose viewpoints are suppressed or omitted from the narrative. Our work demands critical thinking, reflection, and respectful community dialogue. From this perspective, some of us have vigorously challenged censorship, as we believe access to a broad range of human knowledge and experience is necessary for our society to evolve and thrive. In my letter, I also shared a personal recollection of my days as a newer librarian at Wayne State University. I was involved in producing an exhibit on lesbian pulp fiction. The year was 1997, when being lesbian or gay was still viewed as deviant and perverted in mainstream culture, and still is by some in our society. The exhibit included panels that I had borrowed from the Lesbian History archives. After the opening of the exhibit, somebody vandalized the works. They painted the word dyke across an artifact and damaged a few of the panels. My point for sharing this story was to illustrate why I am convinced that allowing acts of vandalism like this to lead to a censoring or removal of the works without more dialogue, and because we are offended, may ultimately and more deeply affect those of us in the minority in the long run. This experience and many other incidents I can relate, including demands from individuals to remove what they deem as offensive books and materials from the library, informed my own reactions to the incident of vandalism at the time. Next slide, please. Next, and this is my final slide. While I was at the U of O, I continued to advocate for contextualizing these artifacts and for allowing the relics to remain uncensored as evidence of the embedded racist and sexist legacy against which many of us were struggling. Keeping them visible seemed to allow what is perhaps needed in a cycle of offense and dissent. As a co-chair of a campus-wide task force charged with examining public art on campus, I advocated for new art and new monuments that would honor and reflect our community, and for plaques and signs that would better contextualize the old art and inform people about Oregon's exclusionary, racist past. At the time, I thought that defacing, shrouding, and removing these artifacts would undermine the potential for us to engage critically about and oppose the ideologies that were implicit in their creation. One of our projects was to call for creative works, responding to the content of the art. We wanted to showcase creative expressions, especially about the culture that students of today aspire to have. The theme of our exhibit and our competition was show up, stand out, empower. And I believe that this art production and eventual exhibit were very useful at the time in terms of motivating us to engage in much needed dialogue about intellectual freedom, cultural memory, historic preservation, and social justice. I have often wondered since that time, would we have done as much or talked about it as much with each other if it were not for the existence of this historic artwork? But having said all that, and after all that was done, the year after I left the University of Oregon, a more destructive act of vandalism occurred. Vandals or dissenters, depending on your view, used red paint to damage the front entrance and the steps of the library. In response to this act and in response to continued advocacy of some students that they did not feel welcome in the library as long as the art could be seen, the university finally chose to shroud the murals. In closing, I want to reiterate that racism, misogyny, sexism, white supremacy, these hateful systems and ideologies are real. In my life, I've experienced them firsthand. However, I also believe it could be a grave mistake to remove visible evidence of this history, especially if these are original artifacts located in an institution where censorship is against our most cherished values. Depending upon the specific details and context of each case, I believe the most instructive approach for original artworks such as these in their historic settings and context should be to further contextualize them, to use them for education, and to keep the dialogue going that would help us change hearts and minds. I believe this is key to ensuring that future generations will be fully informed in their quest for knowledge and justice. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to Karen's remarks and our discussion later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lim, for that wonderful presentation. Before I briefly present the next two case studies, I just want to note, in case anyone that just recently joined, feel free to add your questions in the chat for a little bit later. And then all of the case studies that you'll be seeing today and hearing about, you can actually learn more about those on Censorpedia, which is an aggregated site that is contributed, managed by the National Coalition Against Censorship, of keeping track of different case studies involving censorship. The next two case studies, very briefly, before passing it off to Karen. The first one, it involves 4 panels that are collectively called the Three Peoples Mural at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Painted by Kenneth Adams in 1939, and they're located within the west wing of the Zimmerman Library on campus. While representing the tricultural populations in New Mexico, the murals put forward racial and gender hierarchies linked to a fraught theory of Western civilization and notions of progress. Indigenous peoples are represented performing manual labor and creating traditional crafts, while white figures are depicted as doctors and scientists. And so here is one of the first panels within the library. This is another one. Further, the Anglo figures are rendered in greater detail than the indigenous and Hispanic populations, suggesting a sense of racial superiority. And so you see that in these different details. The murals have been a source of tension for a number of decades and have been defaced in the past, specifically in the 1970s. In 2016, the library staff wrote a letter to the Dean of Libraries expressing their frustrations and grievances with the murals, arguing that they create a hostile, unwelcome environment for students, staff, and visiting scholars. At one point, the university considered a retractable curtain or veil as a solution to keep the murals in place while still having them accessible for educational purposes. In the spring of 2018, an interdisciplinary class was designed and offered to students by Professors Alex Luman and Kimberly Pender. The purpose of the class was to contextualize the murals and provide an opportunity for students to make recommendations on next steps. Every class was open to the public, and anyone could view the syllabus and videos of the guest lectures online. In total, there were 32 guest lectures, including some where university alumni came back on campus to explain when they protested the presence of the murals. Last year, in 2020, staff members at the library started a petition to have the murals removed. In September of last year, the University of New Mexico submitted an application for the removal of these murals, which are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So their status, like many other WPA murals, are in a sense of limbo right now. Related to those, the next set of images I want to talk about, and these are also a set of 3 murals in total that comprise a series that was done by WPA artist Clarence Peters. These were all painted in 1935 on the University of Wisconsin Stouts campus in separate academic buildings. So the first image you're seeing is titled French Trappers on the Red Cedar, located within a hallway in Michael's Hall and Jarvis Hall. The second image is titled Learning, Industry, Skill, and Honor. And this is one that has perhaps received some of the most criticism, has received the most focus because of the location within Harvey Hall, which it's located on the grand staircase. And so hopefully a little bit later in the discussion, we can talk about kind of the role of spatial politics. And what I mean by that is many of these structures that house these murals are used for different academic purposes on campus, and they relate to the different missions of universities. They relate to, they really get to the heart of what the university represents. And so having the presence of some of these murals within those sites is certainly problematic, and how do you navigate that? So I hope we can talk about that at Memorial Hall on the University of Kentucky's campus, as well as at Knight Library in Oregon. And the last from this set of three is titled Parole's Trading Fort. This is located in the Applied Arts Building. Collectively, these paintings depict interactions between white traders and First Nations people. Some constituents at the university have raised concerns that the depictions reinforce racial stereotypes of Indigenous communities, and the presence of the artworks prevent the university from being a fully inclusive educational environment. In 2013, under the guidance of UW Stout professors, art students began restoring the murals in preparation for Harvey Hall's grand reopening. Professor Joan Navarre oversaw 2 classes that investigated the murals and made use of UW Stout's archives, which later led to some students presenting their research findings at an academic conference. Some of the other classes that were conceived and executed on campus included Introduction to Art and Design, where students completed drawings and architectural elements within Harvey Hall. One English class that Professor Navarre offered was called Art and Design Living and Learning Community. And so this is where students investigated the murals by Peters. They created informational exhibits about facets of the project history, including doing a comparison with other WPA muralists. They detailed descriptions of the artist studio on campus and analyzed how the artwork's messages related to the mission of the Stout campus. And one of the final classes that was offered was a digital humanities capstone course, where senior professional communication and emerging media students performed either independent or collaborative archival research that served as their capstone work in their program's curriculum. One team created an augmented reality interface to interpret controversial WPA murals on campus. But ultimately, under mounting pressure, the university decided that 2 of the works in question would be relocated to storage. And an announcement later in 2016, Chancellor Bob Meyer clarified to say that the paintings would instead be placed in a more controlled viewing space where more context could be offered. So I'll keep it there. I mean, obviously there's a lot more to say, but I would like to keep the bulk of our presentations and discussions today focused on the University of Oregon case and the University of Kentucky case. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen so that our next presenter can queue up her presentation. So I'll pass it off to you, Karen.
You're just seeing the image with the work? Okay. I am thrilled to be here. This is such a I feel as though it's almost like a never-ending conversation, and I think that's part of it. There's something about that's perpetual resolution about it. So I'll just start with that. So this is a 1934 New Deal era mural by Anne Weissel Hanlon, and has been at the center of debate at the University of Kentucky for many years. Viewed through contemporary eyes, the fresco sanitizes history and glosses over the brutality, pain, and suffering that slavery imposed. And it presents a caricature portrayal of Native Americans. This is actually the only Native American that's portrayed in the entire mural. You have these, happy musicians playing music for the white elite. You have a boy in the tree denied access to the performance venue, but sneaking a view from the tree. So the university's president decided in 2015 to cloak the mural for almost 2 years, hoping, I think, to buy time for the campus community to determine what to do next after all the protests that have been happening. So over the course, over the course of those 2 years, many people were upset, including Wendell Berry, and there's a lawsuit actually happening right now about covering the mural. But they decided the right thing to do was perhaps to commission an artist to make a work that would be in conversation with this contested mural. So I felt really honored and kind of humbled and worried too about making a work that would be in conversation. So this image is of the vestibule Memorial Hall. It's right outside the lobby entrance to where the mural is housed. And the first thing I noticed was this dome ceiling. The dome ceiling it's like 16 feet in diameter. It's about 26 feet off the ground. And I was intrigued and decided to kind of use the dome and its surrounding architecture as the site of my intervention. And I just started thinking, like, in a way, it raised kind of interesting questions from the beginning, like, why was this space designed in this way? What does it mean to create a dome vestibule in an academic building? Domes date back to prehistory and have ties to indigenous building traditions, Byzantine and Islamic architecture. So what symbolism does it have in a building dedicated to higher education? So my hope was for the initial recognition, or someone kind of coming into the space and recognizing the particularities of the space, would lead to much bigger questions. And I often turn to James Baldwin in his assessment of the role of art, which is really to expose the question the answer hides. So I gilded the dome ceiling and inserted painted reproductions of all the brown and black figures from the fresco. I created copies of each figure, scaling them up proportionately to fit comfortably into the dome ceiling. At the heart of my gesture was the act of liberating these beings, these figures, from the context of whiteness. What possible agency could be gained without the surrounding whiteness that they were previously resigned to? The subjugated, those deemed lowly, were in one sense elevated to the divine. And of course, the gold leaf makes reference to Renaissance and Byzantine churches, kind of elevating them to the level of saints. I was also thinking about celestial beings and constellations and stars. My hope was for these figures on the ceiling to reinforce the notion or possibility of rebirth, perhaps spiritually, but more importantly through the viewer's kind of reinvestigation, interrogation, reckoning with America's complex histories. Here in the fresco, the horse carriage driver is seen resting. In my reinterpretation, my placement, I kind of positioned him in this dreamlike space. So this surreal scene kind of hints at, or perhaps directly points to, the violence of the times as the resting driver descends in close proximity to the sickle of the field hand, who's most likely a slave working the land. This group of Black folks are looking on at the train station. Of course, they're denied access to it. And I began to refer to them as the witnesses, both the literal and metaphoric witnesses to the atrocities and oppressions of the times. And I turned to Frederick Douglass to provide a quote that would hold these celestial beings around the base of the dome. The quote is, "There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him." I was conscious of the building being Memorial Hall, which honored Kentuckians who died in World War I. And I decided then to honor and memorialize 4 under-recognized Kentuckians in the space below, these 4 medallions in the space. So this is a representation of Georgia Powers. She was the first African-American to serve in the Kentucky Senate. She sponsored bills prohibiting employment discrimination and sex and age discrimination. This represents Chief Redbird, a Cherokee who lived among the white settlers in Clay County until he was murdered by 2 Tennessee men. The 2 white men were never tried in court. This is Peter Dorette, a former slave and preacher who founded First African Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky in 1790. I couldn't find any representations of Dorette in any archives, so I decided to portray him with a silhouetted head. And this was a popular way of making portraits before the invention of the common use of photography in the 1800s. But in a sense, I was kind of forced to present Peter Dorette as an almost anonymous figure. And of course, that speaks about and speaks to who gets to be remembered, whose images in the 1800s were worthy of being documented, painted, recorded, and preserved, who gets to be in the archive. And this is Charlotte Dupree, another representation of, imagined representation, who was an enslaved African-American woman who filed a freedom suit in 1829 against her master, Henry Clay, who was at that time the country's Secretary of State. This case went to court 17 years before Dred Scott filed his more famous legal challenge to slavery. And after Clay's tenure in Washington, Dupree refused to return to his home in Kentucky and was jailed. So the piece is titled Witness, and I needed a title that was both a noun and a verb. It was important for my insertion to serve the particulars of the site and an academic institution where the piece needed to be layered enough in content for repeat viewings by students, staff, and faculty on their way to class. You know, my hope was for the piece to be a teaching tool for the school where different departments and disciplines could use it. There's kind of obvious ones: art history, religion, economics, history, African and African-American studies. I was thinking too of the complex and various interpretations of gold. Yes, it could elevate the anonymous figures to the divine, to saints, but the gold leaf can also be interpreted as a literal reminder of the time when Blacks were only valued as currency, as commodity, and the trading and sometimes theft of gold from Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa during the Roman Empire. So on June 5th, in the wake of the demands for racial justice prompted by the death of George Floyd, the university's president announced his decision to remove the O'Hanlon mural. And to me, it seemed like a quick fix to quell the Black fury and rage that was being felt from Lexington to Louisville. And the decision to remove O'Hanlon's mural also kind of, in essence, rendered my work, Witness, blind and mute. It can't exist without the past it sought to confront. And to me, there was a great bit of irony to that decision to censor the original work, because in one fell swoop, it censored my installation too. So instead of kind of embracing the polemics the two works engendered, a potential thoughtful dialogue or between a white woman from 1934 and a Black woman of today, kind of a seemingly good deed a political correctness was offered up to Black members of the community in the university who opposed the mural. You know, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post last summer, and I wrote, Witness was not created to magically dispel or absolve the University of Kentucky from embedded institutional white supremacy and oppression. I was thinking when I finished my piece, I assumed that that the university's real work would begin the moment the last, once the piece was installed. I thought that there would be programming, seminars, perhaps curricular inclusion of these works, a site where the community could wrestle with the very problematic, paradoxical, simultaneous, and fragmented histories that we have to kind of contend with. So the decision to tear down, I mean, it was really unfortunate. And then there's the irony of the committed purposefully selecting a Black female artist to make a responsive work and then in essence silencing her. So I think about when we talk about solving racism and the do-good work of liberals, how and where is the real work actually getting and being done? And to me, it was pretty heartbreaking and a strange feeling too, as it seemed to also render these Black and brown figures, kind of make them anonymous again for a second time, an attempt to offer what I had hoped would be agency and autonomy, for these 25 souls was completely dismissed. And I think I'll end there.
Well, thank you so much, Karen, for that presentation. So I'd like to bring us back together just for a moment to talk about a little bit more in detail in particular, these two case studies. And so I think listening to you talk and listening to Dr. Lim talk, how these murals created at the same time in this unique moment in American history of really trying to be uplifting and be harmonious, and it's really espousing these like ideals and our national character and just very, very lofty ambitions. But oftentimes in moments of trying to unify or harmonize, a lot of things get flattened. And so I think that it's a useful metaphor, not my own, but certainly borrowed, that oftentimes in public art and different ways of summarizing the past, it's this abbreviation or truncation, this flattening of the topography or the landscape of history. And so your work, along with the programs and exhibitions that Dr. Lim was involved with facilitating, along with other university administrators, are trying to basically inject a little bit more depth back into this topographic map of the American landscape, and to take subjectivities and identities and experiences from the margins and recenter them or center them for the first time, and to give expression to these lived experiences and these stories that have traditionally been elided from, left out of officially sanctioned histories. So I'm curious if I could pose a question to you both about, there are certain forms of public art I think you can do that with, but then there's other categories or classes of images and statuary and just forms of public art that cannot be used as a tool for reckoning and interrogation and investigation. So how should university, because we're specifically focusing on librarians and those on public campuses, how do you navigate this really thorny path between using what's there to confront a racist legacy, and like how do you differentiate between these different categories of images? So between the WPA mural to a statue of Columbus to a statue of a Confederate general.
So Anthony, I will just jump in to say that in my own remarks, I emphasized my belief that the context of the situation definitely should be taken into account. And that might include such considerations as who paid for the art, what were the intentions of the maker, where is the location of the art, is it in a public space with no other context nearby, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to answer a question such as you posed when one believes that the specifics of each case do have to come into play. That's why whenever I do talk about the murals and the experiences I had with it at Oregon, I'm always asked in the next breath by many people, well, do you support Confederate statues remaining in place? And of course, having read what I've read about these Confederate statues, most of them, that they were produced long after the Civil War and in a program meant to reinforce Jim Crow and other racist oppression, that to me is different from the context that I explained in my remarks. So I won't re-explain it, but, and also the fact of the location. You talked about spatial, politics. I think I would have felt differently, maybe, and maybe my responses would have been different if, for example, the murals and the artwork were in a classroom, let's say, or a place where you really had to be almost a captive audience to it. And as we do in these instances, when we look to other minds and other perspectives to try to, correct ourselves, either correct or reaffirm what we're thinking. I did read scholars in other controversies who did agree with that take, that depending on where it is, that balance you're trying to do between the pain of being a person of color and seeing these images and having to live with them, versus the good they might do to create and engender more dialogue and more change of hearts and minds, that balance. If it gets one out of balance, that's when maybe the response would be to move the art into a different context. Now, I would say that before I would say destroy the art. But anyway, I hope I didn't go on too long, but it's such a complex issue that is hard to answer in an easy fashion.
I mean, for me, all the Confederate monuments have to get out of the public square. To me, I believe that there are other places, maybe some of them can be kept. But to me, there's a line there for me with the Confederate monuments in terms of the public sphere. Yeah. I mean, I think about, I mean, I ended up writing that Washington Post op-ed. It was really kind of triggered by, of course, the president's decision, but it was also, I'd heard about the HBO deciding to pull Gone with the Wind until they could come up with the context and the language to say, yes, this piece is a masterpiece. Yes, it's a racist film, but how do we deal with these two things existing? And if we create a context for understanding the time and talk about maybe potentially where we are today, which is still a racist country, at least it allows an understanding. So to me, of course, if there's something that has artistic merit, it shouldn't be destroyed. But to me, for me, the Confederate monuments for me is a pretty absolute for me.
Yeah, I think back to a webinar that I was listening to last year, and I believe it was Del Upton, who's an art historian at UCLA, who has mentioned that there's not very much nuance to Confederate monuments, whereas, we can afford to melt them down or to take them out of view, or whereas works like O'Hanlon's or Rehnquist, there is enough nuance to be able to use it as a tool within a educational environment or contextualization measures that there is, just to kind of.
Yeah, I mean, they were insertions of power. They were about power of someone over someone else. So to me, that's very different than thinking about a complicated site where I think about empathy. Like, what's a space that we can create where we can have, I think about history is told to us. We read history as this linear way, but history is revealed. All of a sudden something gets unearthed and we discover something in history. So we're already dealing with these innumerable histories that are being revealed and that are coexisting. Mm-hmm. So I think if we could just be conscious of that fact, but within the history, like, where is there a site for us to kind of use it? I was thinking about even with, I remember when Beloved came out, and even later when 12 Years a Slave came out, a lot of Black folks protested. They were against it. And I understood it was like the pornography of Black pain. It gets to be, it's too much to bear. But the other side to me is that we can't deny history. We need the history as reminders. We need the histories as a thing to point to. Like, we cannot do that again, or if we do it again. So it's complicated.
Yeah. I'm curious, Dr. Lim, if you could speak a little bit more about, ultimately, I mean, both of you in different ways have tried to open up these discursive spaces to try and use the murals to lead to more nuanced, constructive dialogues that in the process of healing and reconciliation and acknowledgement, but also, trying to move forward. So you in your talk, you mentioned a student-led or exhibition of student art. So what was the range of media in that exhibition, and were many of them related to contemporary issues with social justice, or how was that set up within the library, and how did you kind of put in conversation this exhibition with these in situ murals?
Well, we were amazed at the response. It wasn't a huge response, I will add. If I'm remembering correctly, we only got about 12 entries, let's say. But we made a decision at the time that we wanted it to be visual creation. So we thought it would be a program that would continue. So we thought, for now, let's focus on visual representations and expressions in response to the murals. And we received, out of those 12 entries, media ranging from, found objects and collages, all the way to paintings, drawings, things like that, multimedia presentations. And they did address racism, social justice. We did have a competition of sorts to say, and we developed a committee that was cross-campus that had students and faculty on it. And we were hoping to find one person that really exemplified the response. And if I'm not mistaken, that person dealt with immigration and otherness and belonging in her piece. So yes, I feel that, and then the revealing of the exhibit created another opportunity for another forum. And I'll mention that at one of the forums, a student came and asked, well, no matter how you contextualize the work, that work is embedded in the actual walls. So how will this other exhibit even be equated to that? There will always be that privilege that it has to be embedded in the walls. And then that really hit home for me. I really understood it. At the same time, I thought, well, then a next project would be to commission a work that we would have embedded in the walls then, and that would be in dialogue with the other piece. So I was really interested to hear Karen's presentation, because now I'm understanding perhaps that still would not have been the answer because of the continuing controversy that's there related to Karen's case. But anyway, I feel that at the time we had those conversations, and they were so important and did help us all to understand, I feel, the context of Oregon and the racist history, but that's not, now they're covered. And there's part of me that feels really sad about that, even though I understand why it was done.
Well, as much as I do have actually a lot more questions, and maybe perhaps after the event we can connect and individually talk. But I did promise to leave the floor open to questions from our attendees, and so they have been streaming in. So I will go ahead and look at the ones that we've compiled and just go in the order that we received them.
What I wanted to say was, I was thinking about how the protests this summer, how they kind of embodied all of the emotions and that protest should have. And somehow I find on campuses, there's almost that the agency that young people feel has kind of restricted the form of protest. It's either like agree or not. I think about this summer, looking at the Robert E. Lee, I mean, it was a site for rage. It was a site for gathering. It was a site for empathy. It was a site for joy. I went to some protests down in Philly where the boom boxes were out and we were dancing. I mean, so what happened to protest being a site that we may not resolve it, and we may not have to agree, but it has a complexity of experience. Alice Walker says, healing begins at the site of the wound. So I'm wondering, like, where is that in the university when you talk about students demanding? There's no space for polemics, and I feel as though the world is, that equates what the world is.
True. No, true. I do feel like, well, President Capilouto at University of Kentucky has been more receptive to past presidents and to the request and of students of color. I think the administration and other university officials feel that you kind of hinted at this or have in the past, that they saw the action of commission and artwork as kind of, once it's done, that resolves it and we can move on. And it's like, it's a lot of work to, I mean, there was hope, I think, at one point last year that the Memorial Hall would be converted into a space specifically just for the Commonwealth Institute for Black Studies.
The faculty wanted that.
Right. And they stopped having, mandatory general classes there, which was a concern that had been raised and had been met by the administration after sit-ins. But now with the status of O'Hanlon's mural in question, it's I'm not really sure what Memorial Hall's fate is, let alone the fresco. So the
Anthony?
Yes.
Do you mind if I would love to address Renee's comment that was in the chat?
Oh, sure.
Well, Renee, earlier in the chat, she mentioned about being sensitive to the individuals who are affected by the images. And then another commenter did write, is there a different type of language we can use other than, vandals and taking offense to something? And I use offense and dissent as just those different sides. But I wanted to address the point about the sensitivity of the individuals or the pain of the others who are dissenting. I hope this doesn't sound trite, but I do think that with some time and distance, perhaps some of the individuals can once again see these images and not feel that pain so deeply. That maybe this does reply to what Karen was saying, because we have had occasions in history where shrouded artwork is then unshrouded. I'm thinking of the New School and Orozco murals, I think I'm remembering correctly. But anyway, perhaps that is part of it, that this certain individuals in our institutions, it's too close to home and the issues have not been resolved enough. Perhaps they never will be, but I mean, where it is so painful that we cannot show them. That balance cannot be maintained. So I do allow for that in my own thinking, but that's why it is so hard and never can be resolved all the way, in my opinion.
Thank you. There's a question from Stuart. Well, actually, sorry. There's a question from Betsy Laredo, who I'm just paraphrasing her question, but she writes, how are people directed to discover your work here? And this is directed toward Karen, in that space. Is there any notice given or on, about, or around the front facing mural? She's referring to the O'Hanlon. And is there any kind of look up inset on the floor or prominently displayed at various eye levels to direct viewers to your artwork witness?
Inside there's a plaque, but to me, because it was going to be in a building where students would have repeat goes, I was interested in the fact that the first 3 times you go through, while it's up there, you may not notice, because then it also speaks about being aware of the space you're in and presentness. So to me, I was interested in having that it wasn't obvious. I was also interested in a way, having to look up. There's of course that reference, but it's also you're acknowledging that entire space. And I was also interested in just countering the mural's orientation. Once you get past the atrium and you open up the lobby doors, the mural is horizontal. So I was interested in kind of this X and Y axis happening, this kind of full engagement. So in a way that's asking for you to recognize the pieces as one entity, if you're having to do that and looking ahead.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's most powerful about your permanent site-specific work is that you really, activate the site. I know we use that term a lot, but by taking the figures from the 1934 fresco and like you kind of give visual form to this notion of migration and displacement, and even situating them on the dome in that way. You've talked about them in the past as constellations, and this by including this excerpt from Douglas on the base that wraps around the dome, it when I visited this for the first time in 2018, it kind of encouraged you to meander or ambulate around that space much as you would in a religious space. And there's so many different signs and architectural references to religious structures. Of course, the dome is the most obvious one, but even as you approach Memorial Hall on the outside, it is framed as a temple-like structure. And so you enter this space and, you're above you is the cosmos, and above you is, if you're looking straight ahead, is O'Hanlon's mural. So it's almost like you're looking in the past. And so you really implicate viewers in this highly contested space. And if you remove, the fresco, it takes away so much of the potency of what you've done and the conversations you've tried to put in motion.
Even in her fresco, which you don't see it in that image I showed, she really engaged all of the edges. And I kind of was considering that too, where I ended up painting that taupe color on that, I don't know the architectural term, that was around the medallions, because I wanted you to believe that was kind of always there, and it was kind of echoing the color that was in there. So you would really believe it to be one thing, and maybe they always existed, or you'd have to kind of contend with these things that are one, but one from 1934 and highly problematic, and this other one that's kind of trying to, in itself, wrestling with it and not simple. By just the fact that I use gold leaf is really complicated and difficult. But I thought at a college, at a university, we can handle this and we can work through this, and it doesn't have to all be understood or explained or decided or confirmed or a resignation in one go. 4 years of education, it happens over time. So I was really deliberate about it being, this wouldn't have been I wouldn't have done this in a place where it was a touristic setting where you have one shot. To me, it was really about the repeat viewing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could go on, but I want to get to the next question coming in. So this is a question from John Davis Malloy, and his question is: describing persons who challenge racism and imagery as offended or taking offense tends to isolate and diminish the impact. Is there a developing vocabulary to acknowledge the seriousness of this debate in a cogent way? So I guess he's asking about, within the realm of dealing with problematic public art, oftentimes saying that someone is offended or who take offense is kind of brushed aside, or it's not taken as seriously. And so is there a stronger term that we use in the discourse, or that is, I don't know, I'll kind of leave it to whoever wants to take the first shot.
Well, my immediate reaction is that, one can be an advocate for more equitable and just representation in public art. And from that standpoint, perhaps you would be able to, critique these public artworks that don't have those elements, and not be framed as such as, oh, I'm taking offense to it. So I do take that point to heart, that I feel that, yes. Now, to me, moving toward an act of vandalism, in most cases, that to me, I think it is very undemocratic as an act. But it has been done before in protest of art that is, that one doesn't agree with. But I think overall, my reaction to vandalism is that it's very undemocratic.
This is a question from Stuart Horowitz, and this is directed more toward you, Dr. Lem. Does the covering of the panels only serve to cover up the racism inherent in Oregon's founding documents? And so maybe, you talked about George Young, and who were some of the, obviously Oregon was founded before the early 19th century, but that getting back to that idea that this is a really interesting moment of nationalism and America seeing itself as this inheritor of Western civilization that's inflected in so many mission statements and city beautiful architectural, civic beautification projects and just the Beaux-Arts style. But more to the point, maybe you could speak to Oregon history and to the history of the University of Oregon.
Well, I'm not an expert in Oregon history by any means, but Oregon was established as one of the first exclusionary states in the Union. They deliberately and legally would exclude people of color, and so Black people, Chinese people, etc., through much of the early history. And then fast forward to today, where the population of Oregon is, more disproportionately white, let's say, compared to the rest of the nation. When I lived there, people just assumed that was the way it was. Perhaps through manifest destiny, most white people went there and others didn't come. But no, that history of actively excluding people and then through racist intimidation and violence, keeping them out, that rarely was brought up in Oregon through many decades. And I would have to say that I think that history, by covering up these symbols, yes, they would still exist in books and other, like photographs of it. I understand that you're not erasing it, but I think it will tend to give those in Oregon, some of whom I've worked with and who think that all racism, this is all solved now. This will give them more space to continue to believe that it's all solved now. One of the things that some of the people would say in the discussions is, well, of course we know better now. Of course we do. We all know better now. And my question to them was always, who is the we that you're talking about? Because then people were dying to fight for justice and to, so to say that we know better now, again, positions it from that dominant white supremacist lens. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I think that covering it will, I predict, lead to fewer discussions about Oregon's past.
I think too about intersectionality, I think it's, I think at the time of O'Hanlon's mural, it was the largest mural by a woman, fresco by a woman. So how do we hold that in terms of feminist, history, but at the same time, it's a racist mural. So how do we deal with those things? And I think that's what ends up getting lost to me. How do we deal with those? It's hard to wrestle with that, but they're both realities.
Right. Many of these murals at the time, both by the administrators on campus that were cooperating with either the PWAP, the Public Works Arts and Program, or the Works Progress Administration, they saw their work, they saw themselves oftentimes as progressive of their day, as, it's funny to look back at some of the documents and just that notion of recognizing O'Hanlon's accomplishments and achievements, but also being able to critique and parse out what she got wrong. There's a wonderful oral history interview with her that was conducted by the Smithsonian Archives for American Art that I would encourage individuals to go listen to after this talk, just because she talks about some of the research that she did in preparation, consulting newspapers from the early 20th century in Kentucky, and how a lot of that reading informed these individual vignettes that she chose for her fresco. And so, but so much of what she chose to sift through in the archive was from a white perspective, and so centering whiteness. And to just briefly acknowledge that the one vignette that has a depiction of a Native American pictures that individual in a more menacing way toward white frontiers people. And indigenous communities, particularly Eastern Band Cherokee and Shawnee, have lived and contributed in the land that we now call Kentucky for 12,000 years. So this is what she chose to portray was a very limited window into Kentucky history.
And even though it was a representation of a real things that were happening, women were being murdered, but it's problematic because if you can only have one representation of Native American, why is it from a real event, but why is that the only one you're portraying? But I wanted to say, in terms of the mural too, and her work with that, I think about that there's another mural in the school at the university called Work. There isn't a single image of a Black person. So no one's protesting the fact that it's a underrepresentation of the labor that built. So it's funny. Well, this one is being, so I think that's complicated too. But then my other thought is, and I know frescoes are permanent, or once you take them down, they're destroyed. But I am, this is back to an earlier question about, I don't believe necessarily all art should be permanent. But that doesn't mean I necessarily think that they have to be taken down because of censorship. I think when artworks are living and breathing, and I don't know if they all need to be here forever, and I don't necessarily think mine do, but when they do come down, it has to make sense. It has to be grounded in something more meaningful than, dot, dot, dot.
Yeah. I'm kind of bubbling over with so many other questions I want to get at, and to kind of push you on and to kind of pick your brain about both you and Dr. Lim. But we have reached our time limit, so I'll turn it back over to Chris, and he can do our final send-off. But I just want to say thank you both for taking the time out of your day to meet with all of us and to share your experiences and your insights and expertise into these issues that we will continue to grapple with and need to grapple with for the foreseeable future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. I also want to thank Adrian and Karen for making the good fight, which is a difficult one. And it was our honor to work closely with Karen. We continue to work trying to reverse the University of Kentucky's decision. I want to thank everybody who joined us for your contributions to ncac.org/donate, your questions, suggestions for future programs to ncac@ncac.org. And we look forward to seeing you all again sometime soon. Thank you.